Hi there. So last time we ended by talking about mummification. Um, we did not, however, talk about one of the most famous locations for many Egyptian burials and the site of many mummified bodies and mummified remains, and that would be the place called the Valley of the Kings. Um, the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, in the lower part of the Nile, was where many, many, many New Kingdom burials took place. There were many New Kingdom necropolises there. And of course, because there were so many burials there, that meant there were a lot of very fancy grave goods, very expensive burials, very important people buried there. And so as a result, this was a place where many, many of these graves were robbed in the ancient world, and in the modern world as well. Um, Now, one of the most famous of those sort of thefts, one of the most famous plundered tombs in the Valley of the Kings, belonged to a famous pharaoh, perhaps the most famous pharaoh, who was named Tutankhamun. Um, his tomb was discovered in 1922, and it was the most recent tomb discovered in an era when mass media was available and where people could actually hear about this and see it, see the results. Um, so Tutankhamun is his burial, his tomb is famous not really because of itself, but it's famous because, as John Green puts it in the Crash Course video, his grave just happened to be robbed by 20th century grave robbers as opposed to ancient grave robbers. Um, but his tomb and his burial gives us tons and tons of information on Egyptian civilization because, unlike other tombs, which were robbed and then when they were discovered, we had to kind of pick through what was left. We found everything in Tutankhamun's tomb intact, mostly. And so as a result, we got an even better look at Egyptian culture than we would have had normally. Tutankhamun was the son-in-law of Akhenaten, who you may remember as that pharaoh who wanted to switch everybody over to worship of the sun god. Um, and we actually have a couple of images of him from his ancient life. We actually have lots of images. His death mask, for one, here on the left, and then this pottery image of him on the right. And many people have tried to reconstruct what he would have looked like digitally as well. Um, his story is very interesting. He died very young. He actually suffered from many, many, many different medical problems. And these combined with with malaria and an infection eventually ended up killing him. But one of the most interesting things about him is his name. So originally his name was Tutankhaten, again named after that weird sun god that the Egyptians didn't like. But then his name changed, and he changed his name to Tutankhamun, Amun being the god that the Egyptians replaced the sun god with. So even his name change reflects the how they tried to switch the religion away from that weird sun god worship that we talked about previously. Um, but anyway, the most famous of all New Kingdom pharaohs, I would say, possibly the most famous pharaoh of them all. We already talked about Egyptian society a little bit in chapter 2, section 3. And again, we focus not so much on the details here, but focus specifically on the idea that the same pattern that we talked about in chapter 1 is still in play here. That at the top of society in Egypt, we have priests and nobles, right? At the bottom of society, we have peasant farmers. And then in the middle, we have some sort of artisan class, some merchant class, people with specialized skills. So that pattern is the same. The thing that we should pay attention to is what's unique or what's special here. What is unique, of course, is the idea that the pharaoh is a god. So he's not just a priest, but he is a god. Although even that's not so unique. I mean, every ruler tries to connect himself to the divine world in one way or another by either saying that they're the son of a god or they're partly god or they commune with the gods. So we're not super surprised by that. We should also pay attention to the fact that the peasant farmers that we see in Egypt are also very, very much involved in the public works projects and the monument building to a degree that we might not see in other societies. But the important thing is to note that the pattern is still the same as we've always seen. Priests and nobles at the top, peasant farmers on the bottom, and then the middle class, where we talk about artisans, merchants, and in this case, scribes, although they might be a little closer to the upper class, given how important they would be for government work. Now, some things about Egyptian society did change over time, and some things about Egyptian society are unique compared to other societies. Okay, in Egyptian society specifically, the big change was as Egypt went into the new kingdom, that is, when Egypt became an empire, more wealth started flowing into Egypt. And as a result, increased wealth led to increased trade, which meant that the merchant class, the middle class of people in Egyptian society, got bigger. And of course, becoming an empire means warfare is involved, and so you're going to have increased warfare, and that also brings in more wealth. And then that also places a more importance on the military. So military people in Egypt take on a more important role as well. So we do see some slight shifts in Egyptian society. We do see some increasing power of the middle class as Egypt becomes an empire. But it doesn't overthrow the pattern. We don't see a change to the pattern. The merchants are still in the middle class. It's just that that group gets a little bit bigger. Really, the most interesting thing about Egyptian society for our purposes comes when we talk about women in Egypt. In Egypt, women seem to have more status, more power, more freedom, more independence than in any other ancient society that we're going to talk about this year. You could argue that this might have something to do with the geography of Egypt. Because the Nile is so easy to farm, men didn't have to work as hard in order to do farming effectively. And so if men weren't as crucial for the farming, as we see in the agricultural revolution when humans get into the new Stone Age, that meant that women didn't lose as much status as they lost in other societies compared to what they see in Egypt. But the end result is women in Egypt have greater independence, higher status, more power than pretty much anybody else. Ramses II, the New Kingdom pharaoh, famously said that the foot of an Egyptian woman may walk where it pleases her, and no one may deny her. It's talking about her literal step. Yes, she can go where she wants, which is a big deal. There are some ancient societies where women weren't allowed to go anywhere without a male guardian following them around. But it's also a metaphor here, saying that women are allowed to do whatever they want, not just where they go, but what they want to do. To give you some more details, we see that women could inherit property, they could enter business deals, they could buy and sell goods, they could go to court, which is a really shocking one. In a lot of ancient societies, when women went to court, they had to be represented by a male instead. But here, women can go to court themselves. We even see women depicted the same size as men in art. And in Egyptian art, whatever size you are in an image, that's how important you are. So the most important person will have the biggest image. But when we see two people, a male and a female, next to each other of the same status, they don't depict the women smaller. The women are the same size. So some really interesting freedom, some really interesting independence for women in Egypt. Now, of course, there are still some things that are specifically, women's work. There are definitely male versus female occupations in Egypt. But what's interesting is usually when we see that kind of division in other ancient societies, women's jobs are all domestic jobs. It's all about being at home versus male jobs being outside the home. But in Egypt, we don't see that distinction. We see that women's jobs, they can go outside the home. They can be doctors. They can manage estates, manage manufacturing processes. So very interesting to see that even though there's a distinction between proper male jobs and proper female jobs, the proper female jobs aren't just all relegated to the home, which is very unique for Egypt. There were still a few women that learned to read and write. And of course, because they couldn't read and write, most women couldn't become scribes or get government jobs. So it's still a patriarchal society. Don't get that, twisted. But still a really good place to be a woman in the ancient world, as far as Egypt goes. Probably the best place to be. Now, we've talked a bit about scribes before, and they're really crucial for the Egyptians because they're so connected to the government, because they're record keepers, because they are the most learned people in their society, because they're the ones reading everything that's getting written down. Um, and of course, because they were so important, that meant they could climb the social ladder and get better and better jobs in the government. So, as in all ancient societies, scribes are very important. What's interesting about Egyptian writing is that they had three distinct writing systems. Not one system that sort of changed over time, although that's kind of what's happening here. When we talk about cuneiform, we talk about early cuneiform, middle cuneiform, late cuneiform, and different versions of cuneiform. In Egypt, we have three different sets of writing systems to talk about. The first is hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are the pictographs or pictograms that you would expect in a very early writing stage, images that look like the things they represent. These were the earliest form of writing in Egypt, and they were very commonly used, primarily in writing in tombs, but they used them for all sorts of stuff. Okay? Eventually, there were two other versions of their writing system that did evolve from hieroglyphics. These were called hieratic and demotic, and I have pictures of them on some subsequent slides that I'll show you. But hieroglyphics did not disappear when these things started to get used. And it took a long time for the Egyptians to adapt hieroglyphics to hieratic and then hieratic to demotic, even though you'd think that a simplified text would catch on really quickly and be really necessary. Instead, they really held on to their hieroglyphics for a really long time comparatively. But that is very much in keeping with the conservative nature of Egyptian culture that we talked about before. Hieroglyphics and all these other writing systems, they're not stamped like cuneiform was. They were sort of scratched in the same way that we would write our letters today. So here you can see hieroglyphics on the left. They very clearly are designed to be images that look like the things that they are meant to represent. So the image of a duck is used to represent the concept of duck. Okay. And you can see that over time, like with all writing systems, these things simplify so that they can become a little bit easier to write, a little bit faster, a little bit simpler to work with. Now, this is just the change from hieroglyphics, the first one, to hieratic, that middle system. If you want to look at all three of them together and see how long they stuck around, you can use this chart. So here you see a bunch of unnamed, unidentified hieroglyphics, and you can see that from 2700 BC to about 100 BC, so simplify and say what, like 2600 years, they were using hieroglyphics. Okay, cuneiform was abandoning its pictographs very, very early, and then got rid of them and stopped using them. But hieroglyphics, the pictographs, they lasted for what, 2,600 years. And then it took another, 1,700 years for hieratic text to develop from its earliest stages, right, to its latest form in 200 BC. And then Demotic script took about it started at 400 and then evolved for like 300 years. So you can see, look how much longer hieroglyphics were in use compared to the hieratic and demotic texts, right? They really held on to that hieroglyphic script, that conservative quality to their culture, really shining through in the way that they wrote. Now, the only reason we actually know anything about hieroglyphics or demotic script, the only reason we know how to translate this thing is because of this artifact that you see on the screen here called the Rosetta Stone. You may be familiar with the Rosetta Stone as a language learning program, but that language learning program is named after an actual stone called the Rosetta Stone. And this Rosetta Stone is a copy of the same text written in three different languages, three different writing systems. So on the top, we have hieroglyphics. In the middle, we have the same message again, but written in Demotic script. And then underneath of that, we have the exact same message again, written in Greek, ancient Greek. Okay? And presumably, this was a way for different people from all different places on in the area to be able to read this same pronouncement, regardless of which writing system they happen to know how to use or what language they could speak. We could not read Egyptian hieroglyphics until this stone was found, because there was no way for us to know what the hieroglyphics meant. But because scholars could read ancient Greek, they could translate the ancient Greek, okay, that was on the bottom part of the stone, and then compare it to what they saw in the other two writing systems above it. And they could use the Greek to help decipher what was going on in the hieroglyphic text and the Demotic text. And the person who did this was a person named Jean Champollion, who discovered this, figured this out in 1880, which might not seem like a kind of a big deal, but the fact that we did not know anything about how to translate hieroglyphics until 1880 is really shocking when you think about the fact that ancient Greek, for instance, has been able to be translated since ancient Greece, right? So really impressive that if it weren't for this document, we wouldn't have known anything about hieroglyphics and how to translate them until we maybe found some other texts. But the Rosetta Stone was our key to unlocking our translations of hieroglyphics. Now, a lot of the writing that was done in Egyptian scribal work was done on stone or was done on tombs, but the vast majority of it was actually done on this material called papyrus. Papyrus is like paper. In fact, that's where we get our name paper. Piper, papyrus, right? And papyrus is a plant that grows around the Nile. And one of the great things about it is, if properly treated and woven together, you can actually create basically a lined sheet of paper, which could then be glued to other lined sheets of paper to make long scrolls. Papyrus was abundant because it grew along the Nile. Yet another way that the Nile is awesome and everything is great for the Egyptians. So it was really easy for them to create this paper-like material because they had this stuff growing everywhere. And as a result, Egypt's knowledge, science, and literary output was huge because they were making essentially paper, and everybody else in the Mediterranean world needed to get their paper from Egypt. Paper as we know it, as in ground up trees that we then press, wet and then press into sheets, that was not invented until 100 AD in China. So papyrus is a much, much earlier substance. And I'll actually show you a video in class and talk about papyrus in class so that you can see how exactly it was made and what it looked like for yourself. And of course, with all that papyrus, we could write things down. And a lot of what they were writing down was all sorts of science and math texts. So medicine, for instance, was a really big deal in Egypt. Not surprising, because they did so much work with the human body when they were mummifying people that they were able to look at and experiment with human parts. So medicine was really successful in Egypt. In fact, some of the stuff that the Egyptians came up with, some of the techniques that they came up with, such as materials like anise and castor beans and saffron being used for medicine, are still in use today as medical treatments. Like all cultures, the Egyptians needed to figure out astronomy in order to make a calendar and know how they could plant things properly. And sure enough, they figured this out, creating a calendar with 12 months, 30 days each, with 5 added to the end of the year. This should sound very similar to what we expect with our modern day calendar. Okay. Like all cultures, they needed to invent mathematics to solve practical problems. And of course, once they had it, they expanded on it. But of course, like all ancient cultures, they still believe in magic too. So, with all of your science and technology stuff, there's going to be just as much sort of magic and spells and things that go along with that. So, one doctor might tell you to, use a certain substance to treat your sickness, but then you also have to go pray to some god to take care of that too. So a good mix of science and math, but the Egyptians were very advanced when it came to learning because of their extensive ability to write things down and trade those texts around. We have a lot of Egyptian art left behind for us to enjoy, especially things like carvings, temple carvings. Tombs, obviously, are a great source of art. A lot of everyday life stuff getting depicted in their art, which is kind of surprising. A lot of cultures don't write down their everyday life scenes very much. But the Egyptians have a lot of that left behind, which is great to see. When we look at their art, size matters. So the bigger something is in a piece of art, the more important that thing is. So gods and pharaohs typically are the biggest stuff when you look at a piece of Egyptian art. Their literature was extensive, again, because they had stuff to write things down on, papyrus. And like most literature, it starts off with a very strong religious bent. So things like hymns and prayers. But of course, as time went on, they started writing on all sorts of stuff, manuals and historical documents. Our textbook talks about this thing called the Tale of Sinuhe, which was a folk tale, sort of a fun sort of story. And our textbook talks about it because it reinforces that stuff about the Egyptians being sort of like sort of, what do you call, very, not selfish, but very proud of their own culture. The story is about an Egyptian government worker who travels around the world, meets all sorts of people, and then eventually gets back home. And of course, all along the way, he's talking about how much better Egyptian culture is than everybody else's. So a good example of that sort of Egyptian superiority complex that we talked about at the beginning of this section. And that's it. So that's it for Egypt. After this, we'll be talking about India. But until then, see you next time.